Hello and welcome back to game number 24 of the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti called Masters of the Chessboard, and we are looking at each of those games one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. We're continuing to look at the games of Siegbert Tarrasch, who has the white pieces. And this is the last game of Tarrasch that we'll be looking at, unless he is the opponent of one of the future masters we look at. His opponent, however, with the black pieces, is the famous Savielly Tartakower. Now this game starts off with d4, and we've looked almost exclusively at e4 openings so far. Last game we saw a d4 of the first move, however that quickly transposed into the French defence, which usually starts off with e4, e6 here. So in this game we see d4, and it's a proper d4 opening this time. We're actually going to see some of the queen's pawn structures and things. Now Reti talks a bit about d4 openings initially. He says that the most common response is d5, and that's still very much true to today. Knight f6 is the more commonly played first move by black, but you would very often have transposed into structures that would have occurred just after playing d5. Now, he says that with e4, e5 openings, you would usually look to try and open up the game by playing the pawn breaks f4 or d4. You may play them straight away, you may not. F4 might be the king's gambit. You might prepare f4 with knight c3 and then play f4. You might play d4 going into the centre game and possibly going into like the Danish gambit. Or you might play here and then play d4. Or you might bring your bishops out and then try to play the Evans gambit or the Giocopiano, where you'll try and play d4 that way. But with e4, e5 openings, you'll generally try and break with the f pawn or the d pawn. However, in contrast with d4, d5 openings, you would try and break with the c pawn or the e pawn. So still the bishop pawn and still the other centre pawn. However, Reti comments that this is quite different to e4, e5, because after e4, e5, let's say you to break with the f pawn straight away, you've immediately created a bit of a weakness along this diagonal. So this bishop breaking is a bit more risky because it weakens the king somewhat. Which means that d4 is usually the sounder way to open up the game if you're playing e4, e5, especially because it's already protected by the queen. However, if we contrast this to d4, d5, here c4 doesn't really weaken the king at all, whereas e4 has no protection, because e4 has no protection as well. So c4 is usually the sounder way to open up the game in d4, d5 games, because it can be easily recaptured with this bishop after you push this pawn as potential checks to try and pick up any pawns, and it doesn't weaken the king. Whereas e4 now would just be a straight up loss of a pawn. So that's, according to Reti, one of the main differences of the queen's pawn opening as opposed to the king's pawn opening. I think that there is some other differences as well, really, which Reti doesn't comment on, but namely that after e4 you have this bishop and the queen being able to develop, whereas after d4 this bishop can develop but the queen can't yet develop. So it's a bit more of a closed structure, really. It's a bit of a slower development that you might see after e4. Now in the game we saw d4, d5, and then c4 going into the Queen's Gambit. Now Reti does comment that this is called the Queen's Gambit, but it's not really a gambit, because if Black were to accept the pawn, they're going to struggle to hold on to it. Reti gives the continuation with e3, opening up the attack on the pawn, and then if Black tries to defend it, then White can just try and attack the defender with a4. And now here, if we have something like c6, this just loses a piece. Likewise, after a4, if they play something like bishop to d7, take, then b3, and this pawn is pinned, and you're going to lose the pawn. And note how White's centre is now quite strong. Now, of course, you don't have to play e3. I think there is variations where you play e4. You might play knight f3 first as well. Knight f3 will be usually to try and stop any. After e4, you can face e5. So knight f3 first may be to try and protect this e5 square. So that's what Reti says about the Queen's Gambit, in that it's not really a gambit. It's just a way to gain more central space and put some pressure on this centre pawn. Now, in response, Tartakower plays e5, going into the Albin counter gambit. And Reti compares this quite a bit to the Falkbeer gambit and the Queen's Gambit, which would be e5 here. And the main idea of this is after e takes d5, you would push. Now, in comparing this gambit, he says that this gambit is a bit more sound, because for Black at least, because this pawn can be immediately recaptured with the queen if need be. Whereas after e4, e5, after White takes, this pawn isn't under attack. So it's going to be very difficult for Black to try and pick up this pawn. It's not going to be very difficult, but they're going to have to spend a few moves to try and pick this pawn up. Now here we have d4, and now in the Falkbeer counter gambit, which we've seen with some of the Anderson games at the start of the series, if you were to follow the same idea as that, you would play e3 now. Basically, the idea is that this pawn is really limiting your development, so you want to try and get rid of it as fast as possible. However, Reti gives the variation after e3, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, d takes e3, and now White has a couple of potential moves. If they take the bishop, you'd see something like, no, not queen h4, that would be disastrous. You'd see e takes f2, and so I was about to take the pawn then. If you take the pawn, you lose the queen. So e takes f2, king to here, and now this pawn can take here with check, promoting to a knight. And so after takes, it's equal material, but Black's king is in the centre. It can't castle. The pawn structure of White is just obliterated, really. Black's quite easily winning here. And in fact, bishop g4 just wins the queen. So that's what happens if White takes on b4. This check, take, and then you promote to a knight. And then I think because bishop g4 is threatened, you probably have to do something like this first. And then bishop g4 isn't really a threat anymore. But they don't have to take this bishop necessarily. They could try and check here first, but then after knight c6, now they can take. So note, after this capture, you can capture with the king because the queen's no longer under attack. He takes f2, king takes f2. Now queen h4, it's here, and this is quite easily winning for black now. Black is able to get a very strong initiative after perhaps some more basic moves. Yeah, you can see that black's got quite a strong attack going on, whereas white's pieces are sort of out of the fight a bit. And with white's king being so exposed, this is winning for black now. So that's why we don't see e3. You might see it in a normal Falkbeer counter gambit, but in this instance we don't see e3. Instead, we see the move knight to f3, threatening to pick up this pawn, going for fast development as usual. c5, defending the pawn. The usual move is knight c6, where Reti says that you normally follow up with something like knight b to d2. You might play g3, fianchetto this bishop, and then castle. However, in this instance, we see c5, trying to cling onto this pawn a bit longer. And now we see e3, knight c6, e takes d, c takes d, and now bishop to d3. So the bishop's developed quite actively, and white is ready to castle. We see knight g to e7. The knight obviously can't develop to f6. Knight b to d2. Again, this knight can't develop to c3. Bishop to g4. Queen to b3, attacking the pawn. Now the bishop's moved. Queen to c7, defending the pawn, and castles queenside. And Reti comments that if black wants to equalize, because black's currently down a pawn, and the pawn structure isn't really quite as good. White's got 2 pawn islands, whereas black has got 3 pawn islands. And Reti comments that if black wants to equalize, then black will have to try and capture the e pawn whilst keeping hold of this d pawn. And castling long gives him a chance to get his pieces out a lot quicker. Like this rook is immediately defending this d pawn. So it gives him the chance to try and achieve this plan of capturing this pawn and keeping hold of this one. Now here we see rook to e1, knight to g6, h3, kicking his bishop away. And we see bishop to e6. Reti comments that black could potentially win back the pawn. Actually, if they took on f3, knight takes f3. Now they could take here, and there's 2 defenders and 2 attackers. While here there's 3 attackers to 2 defenders. So in this instance, black could potentially win the pawn. However, after something like bishop to e4, Reti comments that white would probably be ahead, even though black has won back this pawn. The material is still equal, but black's king is quite weak, and white has the bishop pair, which means that white's probably going to stand quite a bit better. White's the one with the winning chances here, with the fighting chances. Black's going to be on the defensive and is probably going to struggle to defend. So instead of taking to try and win this pawn, we see bishop to e6, keeping the bishop pair. Bishop to e4. Now we see knight g takes e5. Knight takes e5. Queen takes e5. This is a nice little idea which Reti gives. After knight takes e5, there's a potential little tactic. Bishop takes b7. So after queen takes, king takes, rook takes, white stands better. Black's got a passed pawn here, but it's fairly weak. They're going to struggle to hold on to it, and they've got these two isolated pawns which are probably going to become weaknesses, whereas white's pawn structure is quite solid. Black does have the bishop pair though, so that's worth bearing in mind. Now we could also, instead of queen takes b7, see straight away rook takes e5, because now this is actually the variation which Reti gives, because he says that this one is a bit better because the black king is really exposed. So if he wants to try and save his position, he's going to have to trade queens, because with the queens on the board, Tarrasch is probably going to be able to get up quite a strong attack. However, after queen takes, a takes b3. Note we're taking with the pawn rather than the knight because we want to open up this file, and this knight is currently in front, almost in front of a passed pawn. Now after king b7, rook e to a5, we see that black's going to struggle to hold here. This pawn is going to very likely fall. It's a near permanent weakness. White has also got their own passed pawn, and if need be, they can, with preparation, just push these pawns and exchange one of these for this and have two connected passed pawns. So that's the variation which Reti gives after knight takes e5, bishop takes b7, queen takes, and then knight takes, basically forcing black to exchange queens. So that's why after knight takes here, we see queen takes e5. Then we see knight to f3, getting the knight a bit more active with the tempo on the queen. Reti does comment that you could potentially win a pawn this way. However, black's chances are going to be a bit better in this endgame. Black's got a passed pawn, but his king is a bit more active. This pawn isn't that weak anymore. You're going to struggle to really attack it. And black's got a bishop pair. This is better. This is a better endgame for white than this one that we saw earlier. So this is a better endgame for white now, and this is a bit better. This is still better for white, but black has a lot more chances in this endgame. However, it's still going to be a tough endgame for black to fight. So black doesn't really go for this. White doesn't really go for this. Instead, he plays queen to c5. And now we have bishop to f4. And Reti complements this move actually, because it looks like it might be sacrificing the pawn. However, if black takes the bait and takes the pawn, queen takes c5, queen takes c5, then after bishop to f5 check, black's in a bit of trouble. If they were to, the variation which Reti gives of blocking with the rook, leads to rook e8 check, knight to d8, and now knight to e5, where there's attack on the queen, attack on the rook. This rook is just paralyzing all of black's pieces. So this is quite easily winning now for white. If perhaps after here we saw, let's say, queen to e6, giving back the material, well, after rook takes e6, bishop takes e6, we're temporarily down the exchange. However, we're going to get that exchange back if we really want it, because black's king has nowhere to run. So rook c7 is forced. Now after knight e5, knight take is forced because there's two attackers on his rook otherwise. Bishop takes e5, king d8, something like bishop takes, bishop takes here, and this is now a better endgame for white again. White's got the majority pawn here, the extra pawn here. It's same colour bishop, so it's less likely to be a draw, and this rook is also ready to come into play one move sooner than this rook. So that's why this pawn wasn't really viable, because even if you did try and sacrifice this queen back, you'd end up in a losing endgame. Now, Tartakower, being an exceptional player, recognised this and didn't go for this pawn. Instead, he played bishop to d6. And now we see bishop takes c6, b takes c6, bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, knight to e5, now rook h to d8, doubling up the rooks on the same file as a passed pawn to try and allow it to push. Reti does comment that if black tries to win the pawn again by trying to push this knight away from the defense of the pawn, let's say knight d3 is the variation he gives. After queen takes c4, queen to a3 attacking the rook, rook h to d8, knight to c5, bishop to a. Now the threat here, if after something like bishop f7 trying to keep the bishop, there'll be queen takes a7 with quite a few threats of, well, that's just a threat of mate in 1 straight away. And here, white is just too active. Black's rooks are, yes, they're behind the passed pawn, helping to push it, but that's quite a slow. It's quite a slow idea. White is just a lot more active. They've only got the queen, knight, and the rook out. This rook is still undeveloped, but it doesn't need to be at this point. So we don't see that. What we see instead is queen to a4, and now white is threatening b4, and now where's this queen going to run? It can't go to there, can't go to there, it can't go to there, it can't take the knight, so the only other square is queen b6, but c5 would just win immediately with a fork. So with queen a4, it covers the queen's potential retreat square, meaning that b4 c5 is now threatened. However, black decides to give up in exchange. He sees this, but he decides that he's in a bit of a worse position. So he wants, but his passed pawn is a potential strength. The passed pawn may potentially win a piece, maybe even win a rook. So if he can try and utilize the strength of this passed pawn, then it may be worth sacrificing exchange. So he sacrifices exchange by, after b4, we see queen to d4. Note that the d pawn gave this queen an escape square. Now here we see knight takes c6, rook takes c6, and queen takes c6. So this is the exchange that black tried to sacrifice in hopes of trying to get some material back, some counterplay with this passed pawn. Black played queen b8, king b8, the only move. And we see c5, d2, rook to d1, and now bishop f5. Reti comments that bishop to c4 isn't quite as good, because after b5, bishop e2, then we'd see b6, and this is going to be too hard for black to defend. Mate in 2 is currently threatened, and so black's not really going to be able to defend this. If after bishop c4, b5, we saw bishop to d5 attacking the queen, then Reti says queen a6 would be an option. After queen takes c5, rook takes d2, white wins this pawn back, still has a extra pawn and an extra exchange now. So this would now be quite easily winning again for white. So because of that, we see bishop f5, because both variations after bishop c4, at least looking at Reti's analysis, didn't work. And now we have queen to b5 check, king to c7, and now if the king moved anywhere else, Reti comments that c6 would be coming, with obviously quite a few threats of the check here. So if it moved to here, c6 will come with a threat of mate, and just like black has a very strong pass pawn, white's got a very strong pass pawn as well. So he played king c6. We see queen a5 check, king back to b8, now b5, now bishop c2. We see black trying to get the counterplay he really wants, and now b6. So white is threatening mate in 2. So we see b6, rook to d7, defending the 7th rank. But now b takes a7, king a8. If rook takes a7, you'd see something like queen takes d2, where after queen takes, rook takes, let's say bishop f5, you'll see again white has 2 pass pawns now. Yes, they're isolated, but they're still 2 pass pawns, and is up an exchange. So again, this is quite easily winning for white. So here we see king a8 instead of rook takes, c6 attacking the rook, rook to d5 attacking the queen, and now c7. Quite a nice little move, that. If after the rook takes, we'd have something like c8, queen, king takes a7, and now queen takes c2. So we'd just be up a piece then, and this pawn would almost certainly fall. Or actually would be up a rook, sorry. So after c7, we don't see this, because if the bishop took here, again this will be mate. So what we actually see is bishop to f5, defending this square. We see c8 to queen, bishop takes, and now queen to c7, threatening the bishop. However, unfortunately, black has to give up the bishop. If the bishop moves somewhere, be queen b8 mate, and they haven't really got any good way to defend it, because it's still queen b8 mate. So black has to give up this bishop. So instead he plays rook to b5. We see queen takes c8, king takes a7, a4, and now rook to c5, gaining a tempo on the queen, queen to g4, and now we see an attempt to try and get this pawn to the end with queen takes a1, rook takes a1, rook to c1 check. However, after queen to d1, Tartakower, the player of the black pieces, resigned, because take, and you just up a queen, or take, and you just up a rook. In fact, he didn't even need to bring his queen there. He could have just played to here, because after rook takes a1, queen takes queen to d4 check would pick up the rook, and this pawn is still going nowhere. So there we have it. I'm assuming Tartakower probably did see this idea, but was just sort of giving it one last little shot. So there we have it. That's the first d4 game we've had, and it's turned into a very tactical one with the Albin counter gambit, which I'm assuming we'll probably have quite a few more Queen's Gambit declines and things in the future, especially because I know Capablanca is one of the future masters we're going to be looking at. But that's a nice little introduction to the first Queen's Pawn game we've had, and the last game of Dr. Siegbert Tarrasch. The next master we're going to be looking at is Emanuel Lasker, the second world champion. We've seen one of his games so far against Tarrasch, where Tarrasch won. But I'm guessing we're going to see perhaps some of his better games in the next chapter. So, if you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you've got any feedback, please drop a comment and I'll get back to it. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.